right, we're gonna start here. Thanks for everyone for coming to this event. My name is Joe Martilla, and I'm with CB Honey. I'm the founder and the founder of CB Honey, and I'm the sponsor of this event. So just a lot of people have been like, "Who's sponsoring this event? Like, is it the Rye Town? Is it the Rye Energy Committee?" We pitched this to a couple people. I'm not going to name names, but they said that they were uncomfortable hosting it. Just because it's a controversial subject. So I set this up as CB Honey, and you might say, well, what's CB Honey have to do with fishing? I started CB Honey in 2010 around food security. And so food security is one very important thing to me. And one thing I always tell people is that if New England ever shuts down or the rest of the country shuts down, New England probably won't be able to feed itself without having the ocean, okay? So I went ahead and I reached out to this organization, NEFSA, who's come down here from Maine to present the fishermen's perspective of the offshore wind that is going to be proposed out in the Gulf of Maine. The other reason why I hosted this is I come from a family of fishing in Gloucester. So my name's Joe Martilla, but my family is the Novello family. And it was about 3 generations of fishing out of Gloucester. So I feel some loyalty to put this event out there, and I feel it's important. So tonight, it's not a debate. We're not going to have people asking questions. What I want the folks here to do that we've invited is to present. And they'll present for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So if you can hold your questions to the end of the event, that would be great. The other question is, hey, are you going to allow the other side to come in and do a presentation? That's absolutely going to happen. So we're going to have someone from BOEM, or we're going to have someone from one of the windmill companies come in and do a presentation, if they accept it, okay? So let me introduce the team that's going to present today. First of all, it's Jerry Lehman III. He's the founder and CEO of NEFSA. He's got 28 years of at sea experience in fixed lobster, mobile multi-species, trawl, and urchins. So did you dive for urchins, or did you drag for urchins?
I dove and tended.
Okay, that's an interesting fishery. I've always thought it was very impressive with that. He's a captain of the fishing vessel Teresa Marie IV for 14 years. We also have a local member of NEFSA, John Borden. He's a commercial fisherman out of Portsmouth. So we'll let him stay here. And he's a NEFSA board member from Rye. Well, it says Rye, John, but I guess I put that out there, but it's Portsmouth. He has 45 plus years of fishing offshore, lobstering, scalloping, and ground fishing. And finally, George Stover, who's a lifelong commercial lobsterman from Freeport, Maine, which is a great place to lobster, that's for sure. And he also has some experience with energy. So without further ado, I'd like to open this up to Jerry, and thank you for coming down here. And I appreciate it. Okay, take it away.
Well, I thank you guys all for allowing us to come down and give you a presentation on some real issues that are going to be affecting all commercial fishermen, whether they're in the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast. I've traveled everywhere from New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, all the way to the Canadian border. I've even talked with one of our board members, is Chief Bruce Bassett. He's with the Passamaquoddy tribe. They've even agreed that what's coming our way is there's just not enough information for what we're being told. NEFSA is an alliance of wild harvesters of the waters off New England, dedicated to educating the public about how best to manage our seafood resources through sound science and best practices of conservation used by fishermen, with a view towards economic well-being, ecosystem sustainability, and U.S. food securities. Why are these important? Well, at the end of the day, this makes us less reliable on foreign nations feeding our families, and for the long-term food securities for this nation that we have been, well, needless to say, since the start of the country, we've been dependent upon our natural resources. The true wealth of a nation relies on these things. When the European settlers came here, we didn't just throw corn in the ground and had corn on the cob for dinner. Fish stocks and our natural resources along our water were the lifeblood that kept this country running. And now this is something that's going to be directly impacted here in the future, but we don't want to talk about. Go ahead. So right here in the green in the middle of the Gulf of Maine is the wind energy area. This is set up for 32 gigawatts of offshore floating wind technology. Technically, the state of Maine asked for 3 gigawatts, Massachusetts asked for 10, but this area is large enough to build 32 gigawatts of floating offshore technology. Inside of the boxes, these are the management areas. We call them broadstock areas. So the Gulf of Maine is literally areas 515, 513, 512, 514. Now, if you look to the south end of it, 521 and 522, those are considered to be western Georgia's banks. And if you get to 561, 562 on the southeast side of the chart, which is the eastern side of the Georgia's banks. These are 3 different locations with 3 different allocations for our seafood resources, our fish stocks. Now, the lines represented outside of the major fishing ports that are labeled in yellow show 100 nautical mile radiuses. So technically, with a trawling vessel or any commercial vessel, it will take roughly about 8 to 12 hours to get to that line from the shore. An average vessel only does between 8 and 10 knots. So, and you add on top of weather, current structures, that time could be slowed up specifically in the winter months. Now this chart here represents the Gulf of Maine gyre. What folks really don't know is the Gulf of Maine is a counterclockwise spinning gyre. The current structure comes, all the cold water nutrients come from the Bay of Fundy, which run along our coast all the way to about Nantucket, where it hits the Area 1 shelf, gets a little nudge from the mid-Atlantic current structure, goes up the edge of Georgia's banks, and the deep water current comes from the east and gives it the nudge, which creates the counterclockwise spin. So you might hear me say a lot, what goes around comes around. Well, that's specifically for what happens in the Gulf of Maine and Georgia's. So whatever we do to one area, the long term is it stretches across the whole run. This is just a representation of 8 years worth of tracks on the Teresa Murray 4 that I did. Now that's just one vessel in the Gulf of Maine in 8 years. I spent 23 out there, about 220 to 240 days a year, using the same cod end size. Now, when I started in 2000 full-time, you know, a rough average bag would have been about 1,500 pounds. But fast forward to about 2020, you know, our average tow was about 3,000. But yet in the public, we're told, you know, there's less fish. That's just not the case. If you talk to a commercial fisherman, I don't care which port they're fishing in, we spend more time running away from resources than we do harvesting. And that's becoming a real problem for all of us. I mean, why are we building offshore floating wind? We're told that we need to lower carbon emissions. Well, Governor Haley and Governor Sununu were down in New Hampshire 2 months ago now. And as I explained to them, I go, you do realize that a boat out of New England burns just as much fuel as a boat out of Iceland, Norway, Russia, Philippines, Australia. The only difference is my product didn't have to fly across an ocean to get to your dinner table. So by destroying U.S. wild harvesters, you're actually increasing global carbon emissions. That's just a fact. It still takes the same amount of fuel to harvest these creatures. The only difference is mine only took a short truck ride to get to your dinner table. Meanwhile, the product coming from around the world is flying across our seas, hitting 2 tar mats, exponentially increasing carbon emissions. This is a depiction of the floating offshore wind. As you can see under the waterline, they're going to be daisy chaining these. Now these daisy chains will be AC cables. AC cables emit heat and EMF. So what will happen is, I believe it's 120 megawatts before it has to go to a hub. So let's just say the 12 megabyte turbines. So when the cable leaves the first turbine, it'll be emitting an EMF field and heat source coming from one. And when it connects to the second turbine, the field will grow bigger, just due to the fact that we're increasing the power supply as it moves along down the chain, which bigger the field, bigger the issues. Now, what we're not talking about is we can't understand whether or not they're going to just have the AC cables free floating between the turbines, or if we're going to bury them between the turbines. Because what was not really told in the public is the anchoring system required to do these is going to either be 7-to-1 or 9-to-1 scoping. And what scoping is if I got 100 feet of water, 3-to-1 would be 300 feet of chain. That's the difference between 3 to 1, 7 to 1, and 9 to 1. Well, these on the low end will be 7 to 1 scoping. Now, the area for which they're chose, I mean, the average estimate depth, I would say, probably for the wind energy area we're looking at is around 700 feet. So you're talking about 15,000 feet of chain per turbine. Now we're talking about putting thousands of turbines in. What was not talked about is the invasive species that will also be attached to these. And that's something that I would like to bring up today. I mean, what do we know about other offshore floating systems or turbines everywhere else in the world? We have 3 invasive species that usually follow along with offshore development: blue mussels, barnacles, and sea squirts. Well, if we start putting that many bivalves in the top of the water culture, I mean, the top 5-6 meters of our water column is where all juvenile life technically starts. The microorganisms, the zooplanktons, phytoplanktons, copepods. Now, between the upwelling and the downwelling, we're going to be doing severe mixing with these. Next one. So this is just the base, a short view base of an anchoring system. So not only will these anchoring systems be spread out across the bottom at a 45, but with the weather we have here in the Gulf of Maine, there's going to be upwelling and downwelling, and these things will shift. And as they shift, these anchoring chains will be having contact with our ocean floor, which will be causing sediment plumes along the ocean, not to mention damaging around the structures as well. And again, we'll be free-floating AC cables out through the mid-water column, which is emitting EMF, which we already can tell we have effects shown from UK studies and acoustic studies out of Norway, showing EMF has issues with some species, which we'll get to here in just a little bit. And then we also have to talk about substations, which is not really brought up. Now, with floating technology, they're also talking about substations that they sink. So you won't even see these, possibly, depending on which way they decide to go. But the substations are going to be required for each one of these stations. This is something that even in the RoBAP in the state of Maine, we're not really talking about. And what also follows substations are cooling stations, specifically for the distance from shore because of the line loss and power. That's something that's not really been talked about at all. BOEM states in their management that 30 nautical miles seems to be the distance where they're going to switch from AC cables to DC. Well, the difference from AC to DC is when you transfer the power over the course of distance, AC loses power over distance. DC, not so much. So what they'll do is use the AC power cables between the turbines, put it into a hub, feed it into a cooling station, because the cooling station is converting AC to DC and the byproduct is heat. So what they're doing is cooling stations, taking in ambient 45 to 50 degree water, chlorinating it to stop the biofouling from the microorganisms growing inside of the piping, and discharging it back out into the open water at 86 to 90 degrees at 100% mortality to all ichthyoplankton, phytoplankton, and zooplankton, as well as copepods, which are the life source for right whales. This is just another photo of sediment plumes and upwelling and downwelling. So just imagine outside 20 nautical miles where most people don't venture off. Well, we do have a lot of fog offshore. I can tell you, after spending a lifetime on the water, I could say literally about 3 months out of the year it's a fog bank. Happens about every year, off and on. So we already know that we're going to have radar interference with offshore turbines. Doppler already has an issue with the floating turbines, and the Coast Guard has not yet come up with a written rule saying how they're going to save lives if your vessel decides to break down inside of a windmill area, because the helicopters are going to have a hard time determining whether or not they're going to be getting struck by a windmill because the radar interference. So we don't even know if the Coast Guard's going to be coming to save anybody if you happen to break down in these areas, which has not really been talked about too much in the public eye, which is another big safety concern for all commercial vessels, even pleasure. This is just a representation of the hydrodynamics. Now, this is based on a fixed turbine about upwelling and downwelling. Like I said earlier, the top 5-6 meters of the water column are where juvenile life technically starts. I mean, look at the life cycle of a lobster. It starts as an egg on the lobster. Once it's hatched, it makes its way to the top 5-6 meters of the water column, where it takes a ride inside of the gyre until it finds settlement. Where it finds settlement, it'll go to the ocean floor, crawl up under the rocks, under the boulders, and that's where it will begin to grow. Well, the problem with the upwelling and downwelling is now we're mixing the species that we're not supposed to be. And now, on top of that, you're going to have AC cables emitting EMF, and then you've got cooling stations with chlorinated water in there. So it's just more negative effects on our, food securities. This is just a laid platform, basic, just showing a fixed cycle onto a substation where it goes to a converter station. I believe Sunrise Wind Project calls them an OCS DC converters, which is merely saying we're switching AC power to DC power. And then from there, you'll get the cable that travels all the way to the substation on land where we'll convert the DC back to AC so it goes to your homes. This is one page off the report from the Appendix N2 from the Sunrise Wind Project. I specifically highlighted the special part of the whole comment, which was the 100% mortality to all juvenile life. And that's something that everybody needs to be aware of. The building blocks of our ocean will be vacuumed in, chlorinated, and spit back out at 86 to 90 degrees, which will have a direct effect against the sustainability. I mean, we're already talking that fish stocks are moving due to climate change, but what we're not talking about is we haven't done enough studies in these areas to determine what stocks are traveling in and out of these areas. NOAA has the Bigelow vessel, which does trawl surveys, which gives us a stock assessment on our abundances. Problem is, during COVID, the vessel never really left during COVID, during the shutdown. In the fall of 22, there was only 82% complete. In 23, the spring survey started about a month and a half late. Then the Georgia survey was right after that, where they did daytimes only. Again, about 4 years of pretty much incomplete data. I mean, some of the data was okay, but some of the protocols that we fishermen feel that the Bigelow vessel uses to collect that data are not adequately what anybody in our industry would ever use. So we have severe questioning. Again, we're being told that we have less fish in our ocean, but every fisherman I talk to says we spend more time running away from those stocks in order to access the same stock at a further distance, which is just creating more effort, and it's just more unannounced regulation and policy for us. And meanwhile, it's just keeping wild, hard, healthy food off your table. This is just a picture of a copepod. This is one of the foraging animals that the right whale depends upon as it travels through here. Now, the right whale comes from the southern region, comes up to Massachusetts, Cape Cod, and then from our spawning grounds, they will go to Nova Scotia. So where are the WEAs when we looked at it on the first chart? Right smack dab between Cape Cod and Nova Scotia. So now, not only are we talking about the anchoring chains and all the cables floating in the midwater, there's just more room for entanglement for whales. It's just unnecessary burdens. And meanwhile, right now, the U.S. wild harvesters, specifically the lobstermen, we're pushing for ropeless gear. Now imagine, we're telling U.S. harvesters to not put any more ropes or vertical lines in the water, but yet we're putting thousands of feet of anchoring chain and floating cables in. Not to mention pumping chlorinated and heated water back into our ecosystem, which will have direct effects against all life. Again, there's the animal that depends upon the copepods. And I'm sure everybody's been watching the news as of late. I mean, what are we seeing in the news? Mammals washing up in droves. I'd like to think it was like 500 mammals, I think, in the last year alone. That's not counting the whales, the porpoises. It's just unnecessary death. Now, in 2000, we had 3 times as many commercial fishermen. Does anybody recall whales and mammals washing up in droves when we had 3 times as many fishermen? But when we started doing seismic surveying for checking for floating offshore wind or fixed offshore wind in 2015, we started to see an uptick. And in 2023, well, we did multiple varieties of seismic testing at the same time, and we started seeing whales washing up in bigger droves, but we don't want to talk about it. This is just another larval status of a codfish. Now, acoustic studies out of Norway showed that 100 hertz noise produced by floating turbines actually call in juvenile codfish. Now imagine that. Alabranches, or like sharks, skates, and rays, can be attracted to electrical interference or be deflected. Now imagine if the sharks are all called into this area, specifically spiny dogfish, which is the abundant shark species we have here in New England. And their favorite dinner is juvenile fish, juvenile larvae. So what happens when we start ringing the dinner bell, drawing fish in from AC power? I go slowing haddock larvae down by 60%, which was another study found out of the United Kingdom, showing when juvenile haddock larvae approached EMF fields, 60% of them slowed, which put them into higher predation. This is just a small example of the loop cooling system. Again, like I said, they'll be drawing, if you use the Sunrise Wind Appendix N2, it calls for a 27 square foot opening, 40 feet from the ocean floor, with a 500 micron screen, which is 0.43 inches. Now, technically, there's 3 lift pumps on the cooling station at 6.1 million gallons apiece. They claim to be running it at a 30% load, but they're still claiming to be pumping 2.5 to 3.5 million gallons per day, per station. Now, these stations, due to the N2 appendix, states that they're only good to 1,034 megawatts. Well, every 1,000 megawatts is 1 gigawatt. And I just told you, right now, that area for placement in the WEAs is big enough for 32, which would require 32 if we decided to deploy the whole area. But even if we go with 13, we're still talking billion gallons a year of heated, chlorinated, dead water back into our ecosystem. This is just another example. Lobster studies as well showed that EMF had direct effects against mutations in lobsters, specifically the eye carapaces and the backs, which slowed the vertical swimming of the lobsters, which put them into predation as well. So this is another effect. So in areas when we're burying cables coming towards shore, well, when we get closer to shore on the ledges, well, using concrete structures and pads to cover the exposed cables. Well, that is exactly the type of environment when juvenile lobsters settle that they'll be looking for. So literally we'll be having lobsters crawl under these curtains, getting direct EMF and heat, which will have a direct effect against the sustainability. I know in our state of Maine, lobstering is the 3rd largest industry in our state. What happens when we start directly affecting the natural resources, which keeps our working waterfronts going? This is not good for anybody in the future, especially for the future harvesters coming in here. This is just another example of the eggs on a female lobster. Again, when the eggs are laid, when they hatch, they'll make their way to the top of the water column. Like I said, they'll take a ride in the gyre before they find settlement. This is another example of juvenile lobsters, technically when they go to make their settlement. This is the stage where they'll be crawling up under these concrete slabs. This is also a direct effect on the natural sustainability of our shellfish. Codfish too, were another prime example. Again, the acoustic study showed that juvenile codfish larvae were attracted to EMF. They did a study where they took a handful of cod larvae, put them in a controlled environment. They were directly attracted to the EMF. So again, what happens when we put floating turbines in? We're literally ringing the dinner bell for predation on our natural resources, which will have a direct effect against the sustainability in the long term. Again, with a haddock as well, the haddock larvae showed the same. When EMF was emitted to haddock larvae, 60% of those also slowed, which put them into higher predation. This is just another example of the daisy chaining. Now, on the mooring lines, they're claiming that they can keep the mooring structure from moving more than 50 feet. Well, what will happen is when you got the 7-to-1 anchoring system out, the AC cable will have to go out beyond the anchoring system. I mean, technically, me and George have been trying to do some calculations on this. What are we figuring? Roughly about a mile of cable, probably, that'll be emitted through AC cables emitted through the water column between turbines. And that's not counting all the way to the substation. And then you got to talk about the cables going from the substation to the cooling station. That's a lot of exposed cable. That's a lot of exposed larval. This is just an example of the anchoring chains. I mean, again, we don't really build that size chain here in the United States either. I think that's something that everybody should be aware of. I think I did a rough estimate on the water depth. I figured you could run the anchoring chain end for end from Portland, Maine to Miami 3 times and probably have enough slack to get to Key West. Now you got to talk about that same anchoring chain is also going to be home to sea squirts, barnacles, and blue mussels. which will also, the bivalves will have direct effect against larval status too, because whether they eat them or not, they still spit them back out dead. That's just one more effect on top of offshore wind. Again, this is just talking about the underwater view. As you see the circle on the top, that is just the spatial area for where the shifting of the... So if you get a hard easterly and a hard westerly, you got a 3-staging anchoring system. So those chains will have enough slack to shift from one way to the other, which when we start shifting chain on bottom, you create sediment plumes. And not to mention anything around the chains gets crushed. That's another effect that we're not really talking about too in the long term. So this is just a vessel, my old vessel, on a good day, setting out. We still have a lot of trawlers here in the United States. Specifically, the trawlers we have left are getting to be less and less every day. I mean, every major fishing port I've gone to is severely depleted. I remember as a child 20 years ago, just in the state of Maine, vessels were 5 wide. Working in Gloucester, they were 5 wide. I think there was an estimated 1,200 vessels there. I think now they're down to less than 17. And the same thing goes with the state of Maine. And now 90% of the seafood consumed in the United States is now foreign product. That's something that most people just are not aware of. Goes right back against the food securities. This is just going to make us more dependent upon foreign nations feeding this nation in the long run. And that's something that we directly here at NEFSA have big issues with. Now, this is the same vessel on a nasty day. Why do I have these 2 examples? Well, when it comes to a nice day, you know, on a clear day, your radar works nice. On a day like the day before, now you got interference. You got low levels of cloud interference. You know, there's a lot going on. Well, next slide. Now you got to add on radar interference from turbines. So not only will we have to be transiting through offshore wind sites with a bad day having turbulence like this on your radar, but now you add on 20-foot seas because you have to get back to shore because of the weather variances in New England. Now you're going to be, well, once the nighttime comes in, you're literally running in the blind. And again, like I told you, if you get into trouble coming through these windmill sites, the Coast Guard does not have a written report on how they're going to save you or rescue you. This is still something we're working on, but nobody wants to talk about. Now, this is just another one talking about a report I've been reading the last couple of days about bisphenol A. What it is a chemical inside of the blades and the resin. Well, what happens is the bigger the distance and the speed on the turbines, what it is a micro nanoplastic that chips off of the blades, which ends up more microplastics and nanoplastics into our water. Well, the problem with bisphenol A is it's also known to be causing human infertility, and it's damaging to all organisms. So again, like I go, here in the Gulf of Maine, you know, we have a lot of wind, we have a lot of weather, then you've got freezing spray. Well, that freezing spray over time will chip away at these blades. I think the average blade is replaced at 2 years per turbine, is what the average estimate is. So just imagine all that wind shear and all that micro dust going into our water columns. That's going to have a big effect. Next slide. That is just one example of the erosion on the windmill blades. So all of that resin and toxin is now into the water. Now we're also talking about putting aquaculture fin fish farms inside of these array areas. So we're going to concentrate fish inside of an area where we have bisphenol A, forever chemicals that are in the water column, getting into the natural food. Not only from the aquaculture, but from the natural resources too. So we're taking wild, hard, healthy product and we're toxifying it. And that's going to go on the dinner table of every U.S. citizen. This is just another prime example. Now just imagine this school of haddock that was swimming inside of an array area. Now it's loaded with forever chemicals. So when we take it home to harvest it, it ends up on your table and you're feeding it to your family. What are the long-term effects? I do believe I was talking to John about PFAS. And we're talking about the dumps here in your own town, about the PFAS getting into the trout, where they were told you guys can't even eat your brook trout in the streams here. Well, what happens if it gets into your water too? That's the same thing that's coming with offshore wind. The zooplankton can take that microdust, figure it out to be a food. And what happens is the forage fish end up eating those, and it ends up into the bigger branches of our resources, which eventually end up on our dinner table in the long haul. I believe another study showed that they took bisphenol A on trout, and they did it over the course of 4 or 5 generations. Well, that bisphenol A showed to show up in every generation. It didn't go away. And again, it's got severe regards to fertility. So what happens even with a right whale? We start putting bisphenol A in the water, and we go, well, we could probably, good guess, we could probably say that the right whales won't be breeding properly anymore either, will they? And again, same thing with the redfish stocks. Specifically, where they're building on the eastern side of these WEAs is what we call the redfish exemption bottom. That is a high resource area for a lot of the trawlers because of our allocations. This is one species where fishermen don't have to buy a fish in order to catch a fish, to sell a fish. This is something that we really need to keep in tune. I mean, the O'Hara Company back in the 50s and 60s gave a good walloping on the redfish stocks. Well, during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, well, there wasn't a lot of red fishing going on. Red fishing has primarily kicked back up since 2007 here in the New England region, and it's been a big resource for us in the long haul, which has kept the fisheries going. I'm going to play a short video for you real quick. After the video is done, I'm going to present George Stover, who's going to come and give his representation a lot on power generation.
My life is on the water. Groundfish, shrimping, I've done it all. They drove me out of it. Now I'm into lobstering. Love it. We all in the same boat. We're little people, family-owned business, and that's all we want to be. We're all fighting at the end of the day for the same reason, to stay alive in these communities.
Corporate wind is a huge, huge obstacle. I mean, we don't feel as though we're any match for their money or their ability to spend to get what they want.
That's going to take over a lot of productive fishing grounds, and it's going to cause a very, very, very bad safety hazard for vessels fishing or transiting in the area, let alone what it's doing to all the whales down southern New England.
I fish out of Gloucester, Massachusetts. You know, I'm totally against wind power. The simple fact that they want to put these things on the water, and I was in an assumption that it was going to be, you know, maybe a small little area, like you take this whole bay out here. Could we get around that? Yeah, probably. But they're talking about 2 million square miles, and they put that up on the board, a map, and it's the whole Gulf of Maine.
We've been a quiet resident of the offshore waters in the Gulf of Maine. We're not the type of people that squawk a lot. We pretty much just silently go about our work and do the best we can, and most of us are just trying to provide for a family.
We're an easy target for a lot of people. We're like herding cats. We won't agree on the color of the sky. So they figure we're already divided. They might as well go in and conquer us now. I'm not opposed to alternative energies. I'm not saying not in my backyard. I would love it in my backyard instead of at sea, just not where I'm making a living.
It seems like our input falls on deaf ears. And as stewards of the ocean, we take care of our resource. If we didn't, we wouldn't have a future. It's our job, and we take it very seriously, to look after the area that we fish.
We're taking localized commerce and equity and removing it from our communities, and we're giving subsidies to foreign nations, which help them, not us. And then we destroy not only our water, but our dinner tables. And then we're dependent on another nation. Really? Does that sound anything pro-American? We're killing jobs, killing communities, killing environment, killing commerce, cultural heritage, destroying the environment for the sake of saying we're saving it because a foreign industry nation says this is what's good for you. This is the money maker for today, and we're just going ahead of the science. We're worrying about wiping fish out of the Gulf of Maine and Georgia's banks, destroying them. Well, what happens if we implement these and we kill them all? We just don't know. There's not enough data there to say one thing or the other. That's what we're trying to say to everybody. It's not that we're saying we don't want to go green. We're not saying that we don't want to do what's right. But if we're going to do it, we need to do this when it's a natural resource that belongs to every U.S. citizen. We got to do it right and properly. Not because some financial company from a foreign nation decides they want to develop and everybody's licking their chops for the quick money. Short-term gains, long-term losses.
When I look at what poor science they've used to justify doing what they're doing. We've been told that we all need to sacrifice. We're going to have higher electric bills. We're going to have blackouts. When that windmill stops spinning in the wintertime, which it will in the Gulf of Maine, it's much worse environment out in the Gulf of Maine than it is off of Texas in the winter. I mean, give me a break. We need to accept those things because that's what we have to do to help save the environment. This will be the first generation which hands our children less of a standard of living. The previous generations have paid it forward. Now we're looking at reducing everyone's standard of living for the greater good, but where are the profits going from all of this? Are these multinational corporations doing this for, a discount? Are they doing this for the greater good? Are they donating their time? Do they expect to, maybe lose their jobs off of this, but it's, even if I work myself out of a job, we've got to, no. They are expanding their profits. They're expanding their influence, and the true environmentalists are looking to the next generation.
We don't know what the effects will be on people that aren't even born yet. The effects here are forever. We have a cultural identity too. It goes back 400 years. And all we're asking is that somebody take account of our cultural identity so that we don't end up, as an example, the whalers did, their pictures on a museum wall. People like myself, the people who attended these meetings today, we do our very best to represent everybody, but there's probably people we're missing.
What I advise everyone who makes their living commercial fishing, you need to get involved, because before you know it, your access to the areas that you've had access to your whole life are not going to be there anymore.
If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
The job you guys are doing at NEFSA and everybody else is 100% needed. Without this, they'll just do whatever they want. You need to challenge them on this.
If we all work together on a common cause, Goliath, look out. You're not going to win. There's too much heritage here to ruin just for greed.
Again, these are just some of the reasons why we in NEFSA, we're a collaborative of all wild harvesters. We've got trawlers, longliners, gill netters, hook boat, church and divers, clam diggers. If you put your hand in the water, we have a fisherman that here to represent you. And what we're here to do is just to remind folks that it's not that the science is all flawed. There's a lot of good science, but the timely fashion for which we accounted for these things have not been adequately done. Again, NOAA has put in comments for the last 2 comment periods for the Gulf of Maine to Karen Baker, the head of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, stating we have no baseline data. So what does no baseline data is? Means we're running assumptions. We're running assumptions using data that was inaccurately done in a timely fashion. We don't know. Why did we just reduce haddock in the Gulf of Maine back in 23? Well, it was because we didn't have enough data. The policy states the greater the unknown, the greater the restrictive measure for conservation. That's why we did it. The Bigelow vessel in 23 left, and I said it only did an 82% completion. Well, it only acquired 42 tows above the 4220 line. The 4220 line separates Georges Banks from the Gulf of Maine. Well, 42 tows at 3 knots for 20 minutes. That's what the vessel does. That's 42 nautical miles of bottom towed. That's a 36,000 square mile area. They literally looked at 1/12 of 1%, and we did a reduction by 82%. Meanwhile, all of us fishermen who've been out there for decades are seeing more fish than we've ever did back in 2000. I've seen areas where I never even saw a haddock in 2000. I could set out for an hour and catch 3,000 to 4,000 of haddock. That doesn't tell me there's less fish in our ocean. It just tells me we're just more restricted in staying away from them. And it's the same thing. What started NEFSA was when I came home from fishing. I've been up for 2 days. I get home, it's 11 o'clock at night, and I jump into bed, and then Channel 11 o'clock news was on, saying that the caught fish landings in the state of Maine were the lowest they've ever been due to overfishing. It's just like, well, that's quite funny, because actually, fishermen stay away from them. Due to the fact, because of the allocation was so low, it costs us money to harvest a fish, to catch a fish. Imagine that. You as a carpenter, how about you going out and buying all the lumber And then by the time you do all the work, putting it all up, well, you're going to get paid less than what you got into it. That's what the fisheries are doing. And that's one of the direct impacts of what's keeping wild, hard, healthy product off the American dinner table. And that's something that very few people are aware of. But enough of my rambling. I'll introduce George Stover. He's a liaison with NEFSA. He's had many years in the power resource business, and he can give you a lot more detail than I. Okay.
Wow, how do you follow that, huh? Yeah. It's just a little background on myself. I've got like 42 years running power plants. I started in nuclear. But back before that, I had a very smart grandfather that taught me how to lobster fish. And he knew I had one too many days on that damn boat. So he said, you got to go to college or I won't teach you how to fish. So I did. I went to Maine Maritime. I did run basically every power plant except coal. I spent the last 10 years working in the Middle East. I ran Middle East operations for a company out of Houston. So it's quite interesting. I get the full background of the fishery plus the electrical side of the grid. What I want to do is explain it to you, the language of it, so you understand what's going on and why this is so stupid. That's my opinion. So right quick here, we're going to talk about, I don't have this memorized, how electricity is made, transmitted, and delivered to your house. Selling bulk electricity, which I did for about a couple of years, and offshore wind and solar. Keep on rolling, there we go. So if you look at it, a traditional utility like we had before deregulation, they owned everything except your house. They generate, it steps up on a transformer, goes on transmission, steps down onto distribution, then steps down again into your house. They owned everything. Then we deregulated, which I thought was kind of crazy because I work for Central Maine Power. After you deregulate, you build a power plant and 20, 30 years later, the mortgage is paid off just like your house. Electricity price drops down. So now we deregulated, we sold everything, guess what? Prices going up and up and up. So in a deregulated world, yeah, keep rolling, Dustin. So electricity is generated and consumed the second it is needed up on the grid. That's a pretty tall task. So everything until recently was dispatchable power. Can electricity really be stored on the grid? No, it's all on the generation side. There's a little bit on capacitors, pump storage, and they're talking a lot about batteries. Well, battery technology, I've followed this for the last few years. Battery technology the last few years is advancing, but it's still 5 or 10 years out. Right now, your batteries they're talking about putting in are 8 hours worth of capacity. So what happens when the wind isn't blowing and the sun's not shining, if we actually did what they say, what are you going to do with batteries? You'd have to have 3x batteries just to get through one day. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. So this is a regular demand curve, and it's really showing over the years the effect has been a good effect of solar. It's really knocked down those peaks. What happens, other than fishermen, you know, you're getting up 4, 5, 6 o'clock, you're getting up and you're putting on that cup of coffee, you're thinking nothing of it, you put your lights on. Hey, this is great, right? Well, I'm in a power plant, and things are not great. We're coming online, we're dispatched, we're coming online, we're ramping up. Any little hiccup in a dispatch unit, that's a bad day. The price of power jumps through the roof, okay? So with solar, it's all good. It's really helping, but I'll get into that a little deeper here in a minute. But if you look at the morning ramp, everything's sort of peaking up, right? You're all getting up, you're using a lot of electricity, pretty simple stuff. So during the day, it sort of drifts down a little bit, is the demand, and this is strictly a demand curve in New England. This is taken right off from the Ice of New England page. So in the evening, you're coming home and you're cooking dinner with everybody's got to be all electric. This is pre-all electric, by the way. And you're looking at, 8, 9 o'clock, so we start shutting down and we get down to the lower part. But there's always demand. That's what's called base load, okay? Next, please. So everything's great until you hit a summer peak or a winter peak, right? What do you got out there when you're floating around in your boat when it's 90 degrees for days on end? You got no wind, right? You get a little sea breeze in the afternoon. That's all you got. You got plenty of solar. And just from running my last few years in the power world, we were running advanced combined cycles. These things are Ferraris, and I'll show you in a minute. They'll run about 50 megawatts a minute. Really, this came about to back up wind and solar. But in the wintertime, that's a different animal, right? So we're a gas plant. And in the wintertime, gas goes to heat houses and businesses all through New England. That's a fact. So if you do not have firm gas, and you are not slated to run, and then there's an emergency, you're not going to have a lot of solar. And I'll show you about wind in a minute. I'll show you a little power curve. Anything happens at all, you're really going to be in a lot of trouble. These nor'easters go for 3 days. We had what, 1, 2 back-to-back that went 2 days? So if you look at the terminology, base load, these are just these are your nuclear plants, and I'll go into a little bit more detail. They run flat out round the clock, 24/7. And then you have intermediate load, and then you have peakers. I ran mostly in my latter years. I started out in base load nuclear, went to large utility boilers with FP&L, and then worked with combined cycle plants, which are just like I said, Ferraris. They're just incredible machines, and they were built to back up wind and solar. But in the wintertime, just a little point, summertime you're okay because you can pick gas up. Gas is available because we're not heating homes. But in the wintertime, you're out of luck. I cannot go buy gas. I've had it happen 4 or 5 times managing power plants up in New England. They say, we need you. We have an emergency on the grid. A force majeure during the ice storm. Canada shut us off. Canada's bringing in, right now, about 600 to 700 megawatts of nuclear and mostly hydro. Well, there's a clause in there, and I've seen it 3 times in my career when I was in the power plants. If they need that power, they cut you off. What are you going to do then? You might rely on wind, but I'm going to show you there's a problem with that. Next slide. So generation sources. You look at wind and solar, that's base-loaded variable. Variable means it's going to give you what it gives you. Base load variable is doing this all day, right? So coal and hydro, those are rock solid. They're dispatchable a little bit, but they're mostly base load. They don't move a lot. They're like dinosaurs. They'll move 1 megawatt a minute. Not going to help you for wind, and I'll explain that in a minute. Gas and oil, big utility boilers, 5 megawatts a minute. Gas turbines, next one. These are for the new ones today are moving over 50 megawatts a minute. Those are your peakers. Like I said, that's basically to back up your wind and solar. And then simple cycle. This is like a 7.7 jet engine strapped to a generator. Florida Power & Light has a bank of them down there with like, I think there's like 25 or 30 machines. And when they get in a crisis and they have to replace that power immediately because the grid needs what the grid needs now. If you don't supply enough power, you're going to have a brownout. If you have too much power, voltage goes high and stuff in your house is probably going to melt down. So they've got to keep that within a very tight band. They have to cross that demand curve every minute. That's what the dispatchers at ISO New England are doing. So real quick, transmission, I'm going to whip through this pretty quick. 345 is really, that's the backbone of New England. I think there's another piece of that, right? This is the highway. So when you see offshore wind connecting to 345, they're going to pump this stuff out of state, right? We were connected to the 115 and the 345. So it links Canada, it links all of southern New England as a 345. That's a 6-lane or a 2-lane highway for power transmission. Electricity flows from high to low. So what we did, we built a system, 345, next slide, 115, next piece please. Back up a little bit. They really give me a hard time here. So it's part of the grid, really. That's your US Route 1. If I want to compare it, give you a little education on what it really is. So 345 drops down to 115. That's interstate US Route 1 going through the whole area, right? And that's the workhorse of the state. Next one. So then you drop down to 34.5, 12.47. There's 7,200 in there. That's your secondary road. That's supplying your house, your businesses. But also take note, now all of a sudden we're pumping in solar on the low side. Well, I want to tell you, they were really, I won't say shit and bricks, but I can't say that. They really didn't know what was going to happen because it's built for the high side down, right? Now we're pumping power, and a lot of it, more and more and on the low side. Well, transformers can go either, did I say that out loud? Sorry. Transformers can really reduce power or pump it back up, okay? So it's all working so far so good. Next slide. So bulk electricity, really, all generators bid into the ISO every day, and they bid in individual 24-hour blocks. Payments are awarded for whatever the price is at the end of each hour. So that's important now. Next slide. New England market is really designed, it is really operated by, like I said earlier, the independent system operator, and they truly are independent. They've been fighting this all along because wind and solar have large power purchase agreements, right? That means they're getting paid 100, 200, whatever the agreement is for the next 20, 25 years. Y'all are paying that, right? You're hooked on this. You've got to pay this for every megawatt they make, and even some megawatts that they don't make, which I'll go over in a minute. So you're started off, how this is supposed to work is, deregulation said, which I still don't know why we did this, but the lower cost provider comes on first, okay? This is supposed to drive competition. I'm trying to think of the exact words they used, and I was sort of saying BS the whole time. It worked really well until you brought in power purchase agreements. Power purchase, you're subsidizing the power. I don't know you, but I never got to vote on anything. We did this up in Maine back in early 2000, and it was a total disaster. They brought in a bunch of biomass plants, trash plants. These are green. I don't know how these were green, but at the end of the day, along comes natural gas. Like today, along comes fusion or some other source that's cheap power, but we were hooked into long-term power purchase agreements. The price of power doubled. Well, what did they do? I came back from the Middle East. I was working grabbed a job in a power trash plant down in Biddeford. And we were our power was based on $100 per megawatt hour back in early 2000. So all of a sudden, natural gas drove the price of power right into the toilet, and they're still paying us $100 a megawatt. We're loving life. Banquets every Friday. I mean, this is cookouts. This is great, right? All of a sudden, the state of Maine says, well, we're going to buy you out. So they spent millions of dollars. They financed it, and they bought us all out. And here we go again. We're doing it again. This is going to work great, right? I don't think so. You be your own judge there. Bulk power, so it's just the reverse. Lowest come on first, and if you're more expensive, you shut down first. So the lower cost providers, this is how deregulation is supposed to work. Low cost providers comes on first, comes off last. We make the most money, so your bill stays down, right? We want the low cost provider giving you electricity. Next, please. So bulk electricity is really a cool thing. There's different ways to make money. It's not just the price of power. We made a lot of money. Capacity payments are based on what you can make, your most power you can make in the summer and the winter. It does vary a little bit. I'm not sure currently wind is trying to get this. So they already got large power purchase agreements, and now they want some of these other ancillary payments, right? How do you get capacity payments if you can't deliver a steady product to the system? Spinning reserve, we did a lot of this as a combined cycle because we sat down, we'd sit at minimum load, and if there are unit trips, you've got to replace that power instantaneously. You cannot, the grid is not very flexible. So whatever it needs, it needs. So all of this you make money on. The system must have enough spinning reserve to replace the largest unit operating at that time. So if there's a 1,000 megawatt unit running, you got to have 1,000 megawatts sitting idling, right? So pay attention to that a little bit. If we're sitting there idling, you're going to pay me a lot more money because I should be at full load where my emissions are the best. I'm sitting at minimum load, getting an extra credit, more money for us, and you as a consumer are going to pay that bill. Now let's talk a little bit when I get into the wind and solar, how that really affects you. AGC is automatic generator control. Like I said, we would sit down and you get paid for this. You basically turn the controls over to the ISO New England, and they run your units remotely. And whatever your ramp rate is, Distance to load. This is what you got to be careful down here. You were closer to Boston than Maine. So I'm going to show you at the almost the last slide what they're developing off Cape Cod. We were down on Cape Cod, what, a week or so ago, Jerry? And we stood on the beach, Dow's Beach, where they're bringing 3 400 megawatt cables across this beach. They don't care. And over on Craigsville Beach, they're bringing another 2. So I'm sitting there, look at this. The transmission corridor, which they say will have no effect on fishermen, is 3/4 of a mile wide. And they take that, you saw that plow earlier in Jerry's slide? That plow comes along, this thing is like 30 feet wide, and it's burying that cable 6 feet down. And it's moving rocks and whatever out of the way. Nothing will get harmed here, right? Sorry, I digressed. Distance to load is very important. So close to the load center is Boston, New York. So where are these cables going to land? They want to land closer to these sources. That's why Dow's Beach was a direct line to the closest 345. It was the shortest distance. They don't care about that damn beach. Oh, sorry, I swore again, sorry. They don't care about that beach. All they care about is getting that power to that grid. And that grid, the closest 345, which I said earlier is interstate power, was going right through that beach. They don't care. They're doing the same thing down in Virginia, all up and down the coast. It's however they can get. Usually they'll hook up to a defunct power plant, which is already set up for 115, 345. Generators online receive the hourly closing price at the end of that hour. So that if we're cruising along right now about 32 megawatts and 1,000 megawatt unit trips, which happens, the price of power could go from 32 to 500. I've seen $1,000, $1,500 a megawatt. So everybody that bids in, if I bid in at 0, I'm going to get at the end of that hour, I'm going to get that closing price of $1,500 a megawatt. Everybody gets that every hour. That's the way it is. It worked really good until we start subsidizing wind and solar. So that could cost you a lot of money. Let's get into a little bit on wind and solar generation. Y'all understand what variable means? I mean, as this wind blows, and I'll give you a little background, it's 6 times the cost compared to a combined cycle plant, and has the highest. I was reading an article coming down. This is right from a government report. It's $115 per kilowatt hour per year for every wind turbine out there. That's one of the highest. That's higher than the nuclear power plant, which is crazy money. So that's why. Now this is interesting. If you look at these are like 2 different power turbines, but they all run about the same. So about 9 miles an hour they start generating. So this morning I'm at my house. I'm working on my boat. It's blowing like 5 or 10, right? So at 10, these things are just generating. So all your backup power is starting to run. Well, solar is a sunny day. Solar's ramping up. But you got a lot of gas and oil sitting there, spinning reserve, making money. But you get full load at around 25 miles an hour with wind. You look that curve down to the end, they all shut down around 50, 55 miles an hour. So in a nor'easter, like I showed you earlier, when you can't back this up, and they want to put 30,000 megawatts of wind, and then all of a sudden they hit 50 miles an hour in a nor'easter. Nor'easter isn't just in Maine, it's here, it's down in the Cape, it's everywhere. All of this 30,000 megawatts shuts off like that. What are you going to do? You're going to have blackouts and brownouts. You have pump storage, which will help. You have fast-moving gas turbines. We don't have batteries. This shows you the difference, what's happened with too much development of solar. It's called the duck curve. This came out of California. This is the duck curve. The blue line is what's backing up solar. This is solar. So it was okay in 2018 in California. Well, a little bit's good. Let's throw a lot on them. Let's get 10 times as much. Well, all of a sudden, your duck curve becomes a canyon. Next slide will show you different generations. So in 2018, this is a government report. I can't make this stuff up. It's feasible because remember I said base load? Now look at the green, the blue, the brown. That's all pretty much base load. That's your nuclear, your coal, And you get into your browns, that's your gas turbines, and then your hydro is your blue. Yellow is your solar, and red is wind, I believe. Look what's happening out there in 2023. Now you're getting into these units that I said don't cycle, can't move very fast. Is this what you want? I mean, does this make any sense? Because it doesn't to me, and I've worked in this field for a long time. That's overbuilding. So really what we had in New England before our latest governor was a very diverse generation portfolio. Hydro, wind, we have 1,000 megawatts of wind. When I first met Jerry, I said I did the math on our renewables in Maine were 125% renewables. We ran 80% because you have to have something that moves as the demand curve moves. That's your dispatchable units, the gas turbines, right? So you have to regulate that demand curve. That runs everything. Am I making sense? So a little bit's good. I'm not against solar. I run my whole house on solar. Once I saw this coming, I got out. So, but this is really a demonstration. The blue line is gas. The red line is renewables. You see them moving together? You have to. You have to have 100% backup. As you build renewables, you have to build gas. But the good thing is, and I've been to several coal plants in my career, and they are kind of nasty. Coal has been coming down. It's had a good effect. I mean, you know, the regulations to clean up coal has been good. And then I think the bottom one was oil, which is almost defunct. So over the last 25 years, we've dropped down emissions in the United States by about 35%, another government report. Because we started using a lot of gas, we're diminishing the coal. Now clean coal's coming, there's 700 years of coal in the ground. Clean coal is a possibility, but we want to go all wind and it's all variable. Next slide, please. So if you really look at the effect, what they're doing south of us is they're putting almost 30,000 megawatts in one area. Jerry talked about line loss. You've got to ship this all over the New England from here. Well, you've got to have all kinds of line loss, all kinds of battery backup. I don't know how we're doing it. I still say, you know, it's good. Renewables are good. We got to do this. I worked in the Middle East. They don't even monitor emissions at all. They don't care. They're after megawatts. All over the Middle East, Far East, power is, you know, they're not all electrified. 30% of the population doesn't even have electricity. India, the same way. So the demand from the third world countries is going to greatly overwhelm everything that we're doing here. It's good in small doses, okay? It's got to be a balanced portfolio. Coming in with 30,000 megawatts of wind, you got to be out of your mind. All right, thank you.
Oh, thank you, George. Well, we threw a lot at you here in an hour. So, I mean, what are the takeaways that I really want you to hit home with? One, the data that we're using to push offshore wind development has been incomplete. Historically, the timeline and the fashion for how we looked at our stock assessments and our natural resources and our water have not been in a timely fashion. We've got reports showing even flounders around EMF cables won't migrate past these. We don't know if we will stop forage fish from going to their natural breeding grounds. Just imagine that. Bluefin tuna fishing. I mean, everybody must have watched Wicked Tuna and everything else. Now imagine if our heron stocks came across an area that was developed with AC through the mid-water column, and we stopped the heron from shifting to their breeding stocks from the inshore, which means the migration of the bluefin will shift too. That's the same thing. We're talking about lobstering. Well, what happens when we take the sustainability out of the lobstering? All the countermeasures that the fisheries have put in for the natural resources, for the longevity, and for the generations ahead, those are things that we did without the government. Those are things we did ourselves to make sure the future of our fisheries were here for the generations of Americans to come. And now we're throwing this under a bus. Same thing goes with the wild forage fish. What is also happening with forage fish? Well, 78% of all the forage fish that are caught globally end up in fish meal, which go for aquaculture finfish. That was another thing. Why are we pushing for aquaculture finfish so hard? I mean, look at the salmon. They use a keratin chemical supplement that they feed the last 2 weeks of the salmon. That's what dyes the meat from a putrid gray to make it orange so it's more digestible for the U.S. consumer. Well, those are also cancer-causing derivatives as well. And now they're moving away because they realize that these cancer-causing agents are in there, so now they've ramped up krill fisheries in the Antarctic, and now they're using that for fish meal to dye the meat. They're still using wild fish in order to pump aquaculture fish into the public, disguised as being green as an alternative. Well, these are things we don't talk about in the public. The news doesn't tell us these things. The fisheries know. NEFSO is a collaborative, like I said, of all wild harvesters. I'm a 5th generation commercial trawlerman. You know, my family, that's all we've ever done. Fishing, 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 since a baby. My kids most likely won't have a future in the fisheries because we're just too busy ramping it down for the sake of development. And this is happening in every environment and every region across the U.S. waters. We just don't know. Like we said, there's not a fisherman alive that's against going green. The problem is there's not enough data to even have an epiphany. So how are we drawing conclusions for the long-term goals of our natural resources? That's the real question. It's not that we're saying no. We're just saying, just take a pause. Do the data. Let's do our due diligence. What we got going ahead of us, we don't know if we can walk it back. We might not walk it back. That might be the end of the natural resources. And the heritage that's been here all the way back to the indigenous tribes is gone. Now, is that the true wealth of a nation we want to live in? It's not the one I want to leave my family. So I'll introduce John Borden. He's a lobsterman here for your state, and he's also a representative for NEFSA. So I do say, any of your local fishermen, John is your man here. So do feel free to reach out to him, and my great introduction to John Borden.
Well, I'm proud to be here. Glad to see there's a pretty good turnout, and really want to thank Jerry and everybody else for doing their part to try to educate everybody. I know I learned a lot tonight. I just want to explain one of the reasons why I wanted to get involved in this organization, because I grew up fishing. I started when I was a teenager, and it's been very good to me. I spent a lot of time at sea. After I graduated from high school, I fished offshore for basically a week at a time, and home for a day, out for a week, home for a couple days. I became a captain of offshore boats and did that for about 20 years. I stopped doing that 20-some years ago and got a smaller boat to just day fish locally out of Portsmouth. So that's what I'm currently doing, but I want to make sure that this way of life and this lifestyle and industry can continue for the younger people. There's a few younger guys here that I see in the audience. Some of these fellows have worked for me, and I've worked for some of the older gentlemen that are here. So it's a cycle, and I want to see it continue. I would hate to see this way of life die. And we're really, really getting attacked from every angle. And we're all individual businessmen and women, but we don't have unions, we don't have representation. We can vote people in and vote people out, but they don't seem to really care about us because we really, as individuals, can't contribute like a corporation can. A corporation can have lobbyists and have, funding and so forth, but we can't do that. So this is a grassroots effort that we're trying to get going, and we're getting some support. And like I said, I'm glad to see everybody here tonight. We just got to get more people involved to understand how important this is. Because once this ends, it's never going back. As Jerry stated earlier, the fishing industry has shrunken exponentially. Just in my time, I've seen all these ports, and I fished out of Point Judith, Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, Gloucester, Massachusetts, Portsmouth, many places, and with small boats, I've been in and out of a lot of harbors. So I've watched that just dwindle as time has gone on, and that's a horrible thing. The lobster industry is something that we've all worked at very hard to remain sustainable. And it is probably one of the most successful industries in the fishing industry that you could say is sustainable. We throw back small lobsters when they're too small. We throw back egg-bearing females. We can only keep within a little slot. When they get too big, we have to return those to the sea. And we catch the same lobster over and over again, ones that we have marked because they were a proven breeder. We catch them. We know that our policies and our conservation efforts are working. And it is just that, it's conservation. All of us as harvesters are into conservation. We don't want to catch the last lobster, catch the last fish, cut the last tree down. It doesn't work. You have to leave something for the future. So that's one of the reasons why, and the major reason why I wanted to do this. The fishing industry has been good to me. I'd like to share that with other people, and if we all don't get involved, it's going to disappear. And I stated this in another interview, that the reason why Europeans came to Rye, New Hampshire, and came to the New World wasn't for religious persecution like people think. It was to fish. It was to make money and to live, and that's what they did, and that's why our ancestors are still here. So we'd like to keep that going. That's pretty much about it, I think.
So can we take some questions? If folks ready for some questions, Jerry, why don't you take a point on it, and then I'm ready for some questions.
So I have a question about this area right here. That's what they're proposing right now?
That is what they're proposing. The green area is enough space to build 32 gigawatts.
Follow up. All right, so I was told that there's, in one section, it's where a certain whale is in a mating.
Actually, the western region of the Caches closure, which is not really present on there, but if you see that north end, it kind of looks like it comes up to a Y. Well, on the left side of that is pretty much the Caches closure. NOAA states that they're guessing that that is a mating ground for right whales. Now, back from November 1st to January 12th of 24, the Boston Aquarium and NOAA also on the north end of the WEAs witnessed visually multiple sightings of right whales in those areas too. Again, these areas haven't even had seismic testing done yet. So let's just talk about that real quick. Seismic testing. A jet engine at 20 yards puts out noises at 120 decibels. Imagine it's pretty loud. You're going to want to wear earmuffs behind a jet engine. The seismic air gun shoots off at 268 decibels every 15 seconds and goes around the clock. So why do we think whales are getting struck? Well, I mean, those of us that are fishermen, just imagine this. You're in the water, you breathe air, now you're disorientated, you're confused because you got your eardrums blasted. Well, what are you going to do? You're disorientated. You probably come to the surface where you're going to be breathing. Well, the sun goes down. I've never seen a headlight on a whale before. Well, if they don't know we're coming, what are the odds of them getting hit? Maybe that's why we're seeing an uptick. Again, why are all the whales and the mammals mostly washing up south of Cape Cod? Do you know the state of Maine alone has 5,600 lobstermen in it? Massachusetts doesn't have 5,600 lobstermen, so why are all the whales dying to the south and not to the north? It's not the fisheries. Never has been. Have entanglements happened? Well, yeah. Well, 42% of all whale entanglements come from Canada. Maine only accounted for 0.5% of all whale entanglements on the eastern seaboard. But we restrict the U.S. lobstermen, but we don't to Canada. Why? This is a lot of these things that mostly the public are not aware of. You know, these are the things that most of us commercial fishermen talk about on a daily basis, whether it's in the lobstering, the gill netting, whether in the ground fishery. These are issues these are our day-to-day table issues. I mean, I spent 10 days at a time at sea for 220 to 240 days a year for the last 23 years up until this year. I'm 42 years old. This is the first year I've ever spent on land in my entire life. This issue is bigger than any one man's fishery. And that's why we've come together as a commercial fishermen all across New England and the Mid-Atlantic to speak out against what the plausible causes are coming to our way. This is going to be something that goes directly against the next generation of harvesters. Again, it's the food securities of our nation that are in jeopardy here. That means your children and your grandchildren's supply of steady food that's heart-healthy, wild, brain food, considered to be an anti-inflammatory, is being taken off their dinner table, and what have we got to offer them instead? Poison. Is that something anybody wants to feed their kids? Come to New England, let's eat some chemically treated food from another nation? That's not what I pictured for my kids or myself.
Jerry, it's Link Dash. I've been fishing since I was a kid. Back when they originally started this in 93, 94, when they put the days of sea reduction on the fleet, their goal was to come to a percentage of reduction in a set amount of years. From what I've seen, I think we've blown that out of the water. And I don't know what those numbers are. I was wondering if you could tell us what those numbers were for reduction since we started.
Well, in 2000, like I said, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but I want to say the number's down to less than 300 active vessels in New England. And I believe the number in the 90s was in the 3,500 range, yeah. I want to say. So just in 25 years, we've severely depleted the fisheries. You know, there's less fishermen now than in colonial days. So who's overfishing? It's not the U.S. fishermen. It hasn't been for a long time. We've bent over backwards to be accountable for conservation methods to make sure that the next generation has a fair shot. But now we're doing development on industrializing. We don't even know plausible effects, but the effects that we have seen out of UK studies, out of the Norway. Me and George have been talking about this now for what, about a year? We have yet to find one positive attribute. We're not lowering carbon emissions. The EIA report the government put out recognized that even if we recognize all green energy by 2050, we would only lower U.S. consumers' carbon emissions by 2.9% for this nation. But again, they never took into account that the U.S. consumer still wants their seafood. Again, that seafood's still flying across our ocean, which was never accounted for. So we didn't lower anything. So why are we raising our light bills, destroying our natural resources? For what? For who? So a foreign LLC can develop and our federal waters have direct effects against our natural resources and the longevity of our food securities? There's no end-of-life contracts for these two. So once they get put in, who pays to take them out? You? Me? My kids? Their kids?
They've done away with it. They took the money out of the program. Decommissioning is now off the table. The developers don't have to pay for decommissioning until what, the last few years of their contract? Normally what happens is they sell the contract.
Oh my God.
But just a fun fact though, I think below us down in Cape Cod, down that way to Virginia, there was like 16,000 miles of transmission cable. That transmission cable going from the switchyard to shore at full load runs 180 degrees.
Oh my God.
There's 3 cables going to Dow's Beach, 2 going to Craigsville Beach, 400 megawatts each, all at 180 degrees. Inter-array, by the time you get to the 10th, 9th, it depends on how big the generators are, you're gaining 36 degrees. So by the time it gets to that switchyard, that cable's hot.
Oh
are we worried about global warming?
Exactly. What are we doing?
I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Well, that's exactly why we talk about the cooling stations too.
Radiant heat out in the ocean.
You're taking 45, 50 degree ambient water temperature and you're pumping it back out to 86 and 90 degrees and disguising it as being green.
And what does
With a
that
hun-
do to those?
Well, again, the chlorinated water, because of the biofouling. What happens is the pipe distance is so great from the distance from the ocean floor to the surface. Well, they need to pump low levels of chlorine, what they call it a shocking. What happens is microorganisms will grow inside of the pipe, and over time, they'll foul the pipe so the flow of water won't go through. So what they do is use concentrated levels of chlorinated water, shock the system to kill the microorganisms to stop the fouling. Well, at the same time, it has 100% mortality, like was said in the Appendix N2 from the Sunrise Wind Program, which was legalized in 2019 during COVID for the Sunrise Wind Project, which is happening down in Cox's Ledge. Not to mention, down at Cox's Ledge, it's also considered to be codfish spawning ground, glacial codfish spawning ground, the last in the area. And now we got ships coming from Nova Scotia dumping rocks on top of area where it's codfish spawning ground. Not to mention they're not even rocks from the United States. And they're not even vessels from the United States doing this. So we're directly impacting the natural resources, but, you know, for the sake of a few bucks, it's okay.
So Jerry, you're saying they're altering the bottom from glacial till to rock that they're bringing in?
Yes, we could be changing the entire dynamic of our ocean. Again, the second slide I showed you was about the Gulf of Maine gyre. The reason I told you about the gyre was, again, what goes around comes around. So no matter where that placement is right now, it's going to have a long-term effect for all of us. It's like a trickle effect. It's a predator-prey experience. How do we collect data to tell us what our allocation is? Well, I'll give you the brief summary of it. NOAA prerequisitely picks locations to make tows prior for the vessel leaving the dock. So they'll have an entire list of 20-minute tows on a piece of paper where they start in Virginia and they work their way to the Bay of Fundy. And as they do this, the numbers they receive on the catch limits give us the allocations at the end of the year. And like I told them, I go, that's the same thing as saying that all species are in all areas at all given times. They keep telling me no. And like I told them, I go, well, logically, let's base that on land animals, something we can see with our own eyes. Would you go to Ohio to look for a giraffe? Would you go to Florida to look for a moose? No, you wouldn't. So if it doesn't work on land, how does it work in the water? And that's a lot of the things that we keep asking. You know, I can tell you right now, I could pick 15 spots on that chart and tell you definitively you can catch a haddock. I can tell you 15 spots where you can definitively catch a redfish. And the same thing for multiple species. I spent 23 years chasing multiple species between the Bay of Fundy and the canyons, 220, 240 days a year. I lived out there for 16 and a half years in the last 23, around the clock, fishing. Nobody ever asked me from NOAA what any of us have seen. I've talked to guys that even got 20 years experience on top of me. Not one individual has ever been spoken to from NOAA or NIPS. And that's going into every port. And the guys that have spent the most time out in this area are definitely not the ones being talked to. Again, this is something that's happening everywhere. It's not just in one localized area. This is something, it's a renowned problem that we need to address. Yeah, you might not see them from the land from here. I mean, the distance, the closest spot I believe from here has got to be, I mean, if Caches is, you're probably talking, what, 60 miles, 50 miles anyways, from here. But again, it's the long-term effects to your natural resources. Again, the cables are going to have to run back to shore to connect to your power grids, which means hydro dredging, which has 100% mortality to juvenile life on bottom, not to mention the EMF effects from the cables. They're looking for a purchase for the area by the end of this year. So once that goes through, I mean, that's no longer, the next president doesn't get to stop that. That means, you know, those are foreign LLCs. You don't just go to Supreme Court and stop. That means you end up in a world court because now you're breaking a contract with a foreign LLC. That's a whole nother ballgame. And right now, they're looking to get as much done as they can and get the contracts for a lease agreement before the end of this year is over. We're rushing this ahead. We don't have the data.
So I follow a Facebook group down in New Jersey. It's called Protect Our
developers pulling out. I don't know if you follow that group or not, but I wanna know who's paying for that? Who's paying for the, wind turbines to go out there? Is that a private company?
Who's paying to put the wind turbines out?
Where's the money coming from?
It's everybody in this room. Your U.S. tax dollars are going to it, subsidizing a foreign LLC to build something they're told that you need. And technically, it's not something you need. Yeah, power purchase agreements paid by the U.S. taxpayer. That's your money.
What's the attraction of these companies to put these wind generators in the ocean as opposed to on the land?
Real estate.
Oh, it's just it. George said it. I mean,
They don't have to buy the land, they're leasing it.
The cost of operating something. I've been fishing
heck yeah.
not my whole life yet. I've been fishing a long time. Anything mechanical left when he's put in the ocean, has a tremendous maintenance cost.
What we're reading now is they're getting 2 years out of the blades.
How long?
2 years. And they're looking at $250,000 minimum repairs. Remember I said the highest operating and maintenance costs? The maintenance costs are through the roof. You gotta get out there. They're talking about floaters, being able to quick disconnect them and bring them ashore and fix them. That's another BS right there. You gotta undo the power cables? Come on. But to your point, it's not a coincidence where the bulk of this is. Remember I said distance of load? Look where the bulk of it is. Going into Cape Canal.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of defunct power plants. What do you got here up in the Merrimack? Chiller, Merrimack, Station? Buchanan. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's no coincidence.
Throughout the country and throughout the world, there are a lot of land-based wind generators. It's much easier to install and maintain. It's a pipe dream to put those things in the ocean.
I agree. But I don't have a problem if you go buy land and you want to have a development, build a power plant, you bought the land, it's yours. This is America, go for it. As long as you have a good business plan, you'll make money. This is at our expense, and this is our purchase agreements. We're subsidizing this.
You had your hand up in the back?
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, I see there's some state reps here, and the governor's had it. What's the game plan for stopping
This is about waking everybody up, you know. It's the education time. You know, we're not talking about real effects. What we're talking about is what the good feelings about what we think we're doing. But what we're not talking about is the lack of data for the unknowns. And it's the unknowns that concerns every commercial trawlerman, every lobsterman that I've met, every fisherman for the long term. It's not the fact, like I said, that fishermen don't want to be green. It's the fact we don't even have enough data to have an epiphany, but somehow we drew conclusions on development and industrializing our ocean. That's the true crime we're witnessing. Yeah.
So I've been attending some of the meetings put on by the New Hampshire Environmental, and a little bit of Fish and Game in there. And the first meeting, they were talking about the mitigation that these companies are going to pay to the fishermen for the cost of livelihood. And I was appalled. I said, wait a minute, you're telling me that the federal government knows they're going to wipe out an industry, and they're okay with that. And it's clearly, I call it, religion is driving this and not science at all right? And it's very disturbing. And the other problem we got is that it's not, states don't have much of a say in this. This is a federal government issue because of where these turbines are. They're in federal waters, not in state waters. They're far enough out.
They got to come across state waters with the cables.
Well, the cables, yeah. The problem with New Hampshire is that even if we fight it in New Hampshire, wherever we have 17 miles, 20 miles, it's going to go to Maine. It's going to go to.
If you have an access point, they're looking at it. They've already got a plan.
Well, what about our access points would be Seabrook and Portsmouth, right? Because there's waters there already.
So Seabrook was initially a 2-unit nuclear plant. They built one.
Yeah, they built one.
That's 345, heavily backed up 345.
I guess my point is that we really got to get our federal delegation involved in this one because that's where the battle is.
Oh yeah, state and federal need to get applied in here. What needs is the pressure needs to be turned up by the public on your officials to say we got to ask the real questions here. With the long term, these are short-term gains for long-term losses. This is not pro-U.S. This is not going to be anything beneficial to you or your family's dinner tables for the long haul. Just more dependency on foreign nation. That's all this is. Not to mention your energy is coming from a foreign nation company.
I just want to make sure I understand. When you say cycling, when these plants are cycling, exactly what this, they're generating power?
They're coming offline at night. They cycle on, cycle off.
Okay.
The full cycle is start up, shut down.
Right, so
Base load
when we
plant.
need them in an emergency, how
Yeah.
long does it take them to cycle out?
Depends
on the power.
Well, it depends on the technology, but the new combined cycle plant can go from coal to 600 megawatts in 4 hours. If they're sitting there idling, they can move at 50 megawatts a minute. They usually minimum load around 200 megawatts. They can ramp right up to 600. You have pump storage, you have all kinds of other ways of doing it. But if you have 30,000 megawatts and the wind stops blowing at 50 miles an hour, you got to replace that power just like that. I don't know how they're going to do it. I'm going to sit back and watch.
Questions. One, you were mentioning about the agent that they inject into the fish that cause cancer. Now, what is the FDA saying about that? And are they gonna have any lawsuits or remedy? That these companies have to pay for the consumer that have been consuming these fishes for a long time. That's one. And two, did you mention anything about how much does it cost to replace these poles out there? And are we paying for it? Yeah.
Oh yeah, you pay for it.
How long does it take to dissolve this in the environment for these things to dissolve?
I think there was 3 questions in that.
Yeah.
First question, does the FDA allow it? Well, the FDA is allowing it, just like the FDA allowed chlorine, the EPA has allowed chlorine in the water too with 100% mortality. Again, there's not enough scientific data to accumulate it, and the fact that we're driving this because, well, let's just admit it, the White House wants green energy. So we're looking past a lot of these checkpoints because it's experimental. Fixed turbines, there's already data shown even in the United Kingdom. Floating turbines is still a relatively new experimental renewable. We don't know the full cause and effects. So we're allowing things to get scapegoated down the wrong. What was the second question? Was the cancer-causing agents. Yeah, well, that's just it. Wild fish, they eat other fish that are already naturally in the wild. Why are we using chemical supplements? Again, a lot of the forage fish that is caught worldwide turns into fish meal, which ends up feeding aquaculture finfish. So the fish that we're claiming that we're creating to stop this overfishing is still requiring wild product to produce. And the substitutes, when we don't feed them wild fish, end up being chemical supplements that we end up feeding them that end up being cancer-causing derivatives that end up on your dinner table. But it's just like anything else. Don't eat too many hot dogs because that's not good for you either. But, it just, everything in small doses is better for you.
You speak about the open cycle cooling requiring the chlorine. What do they do in nuclear plants?
That's been outlawed since the last nuclear plant was put in.
Well,
Because of the data, everything that...
So why is it allowed here and not nuclear?
That's a great question. Chlorine? I would love to take a gallon down to my intake and dump it because the intakes fill up with mussels.
That's right.
We can't do that.
Exactly.
Now all of a sudden, what you can do is air-cooled condensers. Well, they told me at the last summit I was there and told me to stop talking, but anyways, they're saying they don't want to do that because there's another fan with leading edge problems, right? When you have leading edge wear on any fan, on a cooling tower or a wind turbine, your efficiency drops off exponentially.
You'd create more fog too.
Right. So I think I'd have to look up the exact date, but it's been over 20 years this has not been allowed on any plant, because any new power plant, everything I run is air-cooled. And he said, well, that would give 17 more tons of weight. Something. There was a number there. It's about money. It's easier to kill everything than do it right and spend a little more money and have a little more weight, a bigger foundation. They don't want to do it right. It's about money.
I think Seabrook might use a manual process, to go through
Well, they have intake grates and.
Yeah. Okay.
But good luck with that, because anything that hits that is pretty much gonna impinge on it,
Yeah.
and that's where it dies.
I'm, those of you who don't know me, I'm a lobster fisherman out of Boston, New Hampshire. My name's Ward Byrne. I've been on the BOEM representation for New Hampshire fishermen on the BOEM side of it, which is pushed by Senator David Waters.
Yes.
And I would recommend that everybody call him, tell your friends, harass him, knock the windows out of his house, whatever you gotta do. No, I didn't say that. But I've testified in many bills in Concord for fishermen through the years. And every dirty bill that's ever been in this state, that guy sponsored it. He's not out for the people or what's good for this state. I'll also say that the governor, Chris Sununu, supports this windmill.
Yes, he does.
He's the architect.
Let's be clear about that.
Unless people get noisy and get in touch with these politicians and do something about it, this stuff's gonna push through. We need change.
It's hard to fight because it's on the news, it's on all national TV every night.
I'll explain something on the news, and even our local news station in New Hampshire last week said they had a study come out from Dartmouth University that showed that lobsters had PFAS in it and New Hampshire shrimp. Well, if people knew that we haven't had a shrimp season, I don't believe in 12 years, there hasn't been a shrimp season. It's all lies. It's propaganda. It's not true.
Most people are buying shrimp from China anyway.
Well, I think-
So
I think-
shrimp's coming from China.
Yeah, the shrimp they bought from, they didn't say where they bought it from, could be one of the local, they said they got it from a seacoast fish market. The shrimp obviously isn't from New Hampshire, right? We can't get shrimp.
That's the picture they paint though.
Yeah.
But what do you do though?
I've been looking for that stuff.
You get on your Facebook, you talk to your friends, talk to their friends, and tell the truth.
Facebook.
I've been shut down, so you keep going.
Well, that's what I tell everybody too. We pumped a lot of this information on Facebook too, and notice it's still on our websites.
Yeah.
Fact checkers can't take down facts.
Yeah, so I'm a New Hampshire legislator, and there's a couple of us here as well, and some of us have been kind of fighting back on a lot of stuff that's been going on in the state. So I have to believe, because if you look at, especially if you look at Massachusetts as well, our constitutions came first, and we do have state sovereignty. And if you need a couple vocal senators, and you need a couple vocal legislators, and hopefully a new governor, and because I'm telling you, it's not gonna happen unless people get involved, unless they're screaming at their legislators to get involved. We have the rights, the people have the right to instruct their government, and we need to start doing that, because every single one of these businesses, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, this is your livelihood. This is what needs to be, this is where the state has to step in, and it's our rights. That's why, I mean, nullification efforts are happening, and we hear about them in Texas and things like that. That's because of federal encroachment like this. This is insane.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, another one we can tell you about. Just look what happened in New York. New York went from 7.8 cents a kilowatt hour. The new purchase agreement for fixed offshore wind started at 15.8. That's for fixed. Floating is double the price of fixed. Can you afford 31.6 kilowatt hour? I mean, I know just what, in the state of Maine last month, there was 100,000 people on the disconnect notice in a state of 1.2 million people. So what happens when I triple your light bill? What does that do to your economy? What does that do to the driving force of your local towns? It shuts you down. And it's a killer. It's going to be a killer. Not only to the natural resources, but to the American dinner table and to your homes and your family's homes. And that's something that people need to recognize. This is not about pro-U.S. This is foreign-owned LLCs taking over resources and destroying natural resources that belong to every U.S. citizen. What's held under the water belongs to every U.S. citizen. It's a natural resource. I've even talked to others in the Senate, and I asked them, I go, well, do you own all the ducks? Do you own all the deer? No. Every U.S. citizen owns these. So I don't ever remember giving up my rights. Do you?
Just a quick question. On the environmental aspect of it, we're not allowed to harass or do anything with mammals at all. And in commercial fishing, we're not allowed to harass mammals. But there's been more mammals and more mortality of mammals than I've ever heard of in my 45 years of fishing. In the last year alone.
A week ago, just in New Jersey, a whale just, what's going on with it there? Yeah.
Well, that's only what you're seeing though.
From the activity being done with the windmills and the added activities, not from fishing, because we've been fishing for 400 years, and there's never been that many on record washed ashore in a set amount of time.
No, I mean, in my 23 years since an adulthood full-time, this is the most mammals I've ever seen in 1 year, and yet we have less fishermen than we've ever had. So, but the news only says it's commercial fisheries, entanglements. It's like, okay, so now it's, yes, it's chronic whale entanglements, what the new terminology is.
Speak to that, because a lot of people don't realize that the environmentalists are getting bought out by the big, huge Dominion Power, Eversource, those types of things.
Well, it's just like, well, I mean, Boston Aquarium took what, 1.25 million, I believe it was. Mystic Aquarium took $1 million. You know, these are the same ones that are pumping out the data saying, well, it's chronic whale entanglement. It's just like.
All right, one more question. If someone who hasn't asked a question yet, and then maybe two, then we'll let you guys mingle a little bit. But.
Getting back to what Jason asked, you told him, you answered him by saying, this is just an information session.
Yeah.
So how do we stop this?
Again, it's getting a hold of your
Writing to your Congress people, your politicians.
Your congressmen, your senators, your local politicians, your town selectmen, your councilmen, getting them involved.
The BOA meetings are open to the public.
The BOA meetings are open to the public. You know, I mean, I just sat down, the state of Maine's roadmap had another, well, chief engineer show up to give us answers. It was the same exact presentation that I got a year earlier, and I asked the same specific question 1 year earlier. Can you tell me definitively what an OCS DC converter is? Now, this is the state specialist. I have no idea what one is. I go, you're telling me I asked you the same question a year earlier. Obviously, it's a cooling station from the Sunrise Wind Appendix, N2. And I said the same thing last year in the presentation. And again, a year later, he tells me he still doesn't know. Now, earlier on that map, it showed that little red box right outside of the state of Maine. That was for the wind array science. It was for 12 turbines, because we were supposed to get an environmental impact study on a localized area before we did large development. That's how it was skies in the state of Maine, and that's why it was pushed through. We still haven't even figured out what anchoring chains. We don't know what the turbines are. We do not know where the cabling's going. We don't even monitor. No one no longer has money to monitor the shrimp in the summer months. So not only do we not even know where the forage fish are, we don't know where the cables are going, we don't know the impacts of these things, we don't know the EMF impacts, but we're building anyways, and they think this is a good idea. That's where fisheries are upset. We do not know what the long-term effects are. We don't even know what some of the short-term effects are. Yes, there has been some studies, but again, you're comparing apples to oranges. I mean, Sunrise Wind, the EPA took larval kill amounts based on an inshore facility based in a river, but now you're going to tell me what the larval status kill is it out in federal waters. Well, that's like comparing apples to oranges. There's no comparison, but that's what we used in a comparison. It's insanity.
Quick question, are these books going to be available after the fact online somewhere?
Yes, we'll get the videos up online. They'll be on our website too. I also recommend when you all get home in some time, we also put out a documentary called Undersea Empire. It's on YouTube and it's on our web pages too. It's about 1 hour and 10 minutes. I recommend. I can get them up on the web page with a video, which should take us a few days just to get out, but I'll make sure it's highlighted so everybody here can see.
So if I got a whole bunch of state reps and senators to come, to listen to this.
We are a board of fishermen here to educate people on the natural wild harvesting that we've done for 400 years and we plan to keep for another 400 more.
All right. This is great. This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you guys.
Guys, there's materials over there, right? And then there's a donation for Nessa online, right? And go to their site. It's awesome. I got you.